Now let's start talking about sorting layers. So I showed you earlier how we can change the order of sprites in a layer. I said we'd mention the sorting layer later. So let's do that here. We can actually set layers for different groups, just like we created this header or parent object for background, and everything in the background is under it. We can do the same for these layers. So let's select our, oh, and I actually made a mistake here in the earlier one. So background is our actual background. I don't want the objects under that. I want background objects to be our top object. So let's take these out. Let's reorganize this. So remember, background objects is our empty one that has no sprite on it. Spinner is our little fake sun, and then background is our actual background. And you know what? To be more clear, let's even change this. I'm going to say background image. So then I instantly know looking at this what the background image is. Okay, so that was a little mistake on my part, but that's a good one to show because doing stuff like that is very common. You want to get in the habit of naming these the best you can so you always know what you're looking at. Okay, so let's select our background image. And if we go over here and we look at sorting layers, so it's on default. So the default layer is basically a layer that all sprites are going to be assigned to. And all a layer means is it's basically just a group. So you don't really need to read too much into that. Think of it just as a group. So like the name says, sorting layer, think of it like sorting group. If we click default, we can click add sorting layer. And then this window is going to come up. So right now, all we have is default. That's always going to be there. Let's click the plus and we can make a new layer and we can just call it background. Okay, so now if I go back here to my background image, notice it's still on default because we didn't actually change it yet. But let's set this to background now instead of default. Now, as soon as we did that, notice our sprite went black. So this would seem very weird when you're starting out if you don't really know what's going on here. So I'm not sure why it defaults to this, but if we look in our scene, our global light 2D, if we click on this, now this is another use of sorting layers. If we look at our light, it has target sorting layers and it's set to default. So by default, it's set to default, not all. So if we look here, notice we have background and default. We took these sprites off of default and we put them on background. So what this setting is saying is it's telling this light to only light up things that are on the default layer. Anything else has no light, which means you can't see it. So let's just change this to all, and now our image is back. Now that might seem pretty confusing when starting out, and it really is actually. Lighting is a very complex topic, but the reason I wanted to show that right now is so you get kind of a general idea that layers and sorting layers are a common thing here. And this is good. So just some quick examples of a reason why this is good. I just want to explain it to you while you're here so you don't think, this is something that doesn't make sense. Later in your game, say if you were making a fancy 3D game instead of this little platformer, you can tell your camera to use certain layers and only display those. So good examples of that would be, we could do something where you had like special binoculars in your game, where you can only see certain objects in the world if you're wearing those binoculars. All you have to do to make that work in your game is tell the camera not to use that layer. Okay, so now our light is shining on everything, and we're going to see all of it. So let's go back to our background objects. So we have our background image is on background, and now notice here that our sun disappeared, even though the order and layer number is still 1, which is higher than our background image, which is -1. We don't see it anymore. And the reason is because they're on different sorting layers. So if you want to view the sorting layers, to create a new one, you can do it like I showed, where you click here and add sorting layer. But instead of having to go there every time, if you look up at the top here, we have this little drop down that says layers, and then we see sorting layers here. We can just click edit layers, And it brings us to that same window. So now notice here, background is below default. So the layers are always going to be drawn in the order they're shown here. So the default layer is going to be drawn on the screen first, and then our background layer is going to be next. So when we look back here at our spinner, even though it's got number 1 in order in layer, that only matters to the default layer. So every order in layer number, we can make these numbers as high as we want. They're all going to be created first before it even shows the background layer. So if we change this to background, now it's back. Now let's go to our platform. And if we go and select one of the objects in here, let's actually do this a bit different. Let's select all of them. So let's select the first one here and then the next one at the end. So hold shift and click. This is going to select all of them. Now, changes that we make in the inspector here is going to change on all of these. So let's go to sorting layer, add sorting layer. We'll hit the plus again. And let's call this one platforms. Okay, now we actually have to go back and assign it. So the first time, when you go into that screen, it's not going to automatically assign them to that layer. All we did was create it. So we have to actually do that again. Let's select the first one, shift, click the last one. Now let's change it to platforms layer. So notice the same thing happened with our light. So if we actually go back to our global light, notice on here it says mixed now because it's doing default and background, but it doesn't know about the platform layer yet because we just created it. So let's just check that, and now it's going to shine on platforms. This might seem like an extra step that's not needed right now. It is a bit annoying at this point, but later in our game, having those separate layers for lights is going to be very beneficial. So for right now, just kind of deal with it. And once it starts to make sense to you, you're going to understand why that's good later. Okay, so our platform 1 here is included on this, but our second platform is not. So if we go, we just have to do the same. We would have to select the first one, shift click the last one, and now let's assign it to platforms. And now notice this one, we didn't have to go back to the light to add that layer because it only cares about the layer. Every object on that layer doesn't matter. So it's only the first time that we create that layer, we have to go and add it to the light source. Okay, so now we have some separate sorting layers for our platforms and our background. And just to give kind of insight on why these are going to be handy for the future, is think about games where you have platforms here that are in front of your background, and then you have little objects on the platform. Say you have a little bush here, like even in Super Mario, you have the bush. Some of the bushes, we can make it look like they're in front of the player. So when our player runs, he'll run behind the bush. Others will be behind him, so he runs in front of them. That's all done by sorting layers in layers. In this video, I'm going to show you a very handy feature of Unity called Prefabs. First thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to close my sprites folder. And in the project folder here, so I have a custom folder called sprites I made. I'm going to create another one. I'm going to right click, create folder. And I'm going to call this Prefabs. Now I'm just going to double click to go into it. Now what a prefab is basically a saved copy of an object. You can think of a prefab kind of like a rubber stamp where you get a stamp made of an image or a logo, and then you can repeatedly use it to create a stamp of that image. Another way to think of it is a mold for an object on like an assembly line. So think of something, say like a car factory, and they have a mold for a big steering wheel that they make. So every steering wheel that comes out of that mold that they create, it's separate from the other steering wheels, but they're all the same in the fact that they came from the same mold. So the objects themselves should be completely identical. That's basically what a prefab is. Once we make one, we can use it over and over again to make the same object. So in this case, a perfect example is these platforms. So instead of having to make this platform every time in our game, and say if we had a bunch of scripts and programming attached to this platform and it had all kind of different behaviors, we wouldn't want to have to go and copy those every time and find it in the hierarchy here, duplicate it. We just want basically a big rubber stamp or a mold of that object. So in here, now that we're in this folder, to create an object into a prefab, all we have to do is select the object that we made. So in this case, let's delete this second platform. I'm going to select the second one, press delete. It's gone. So now we only have one platform. Select that platform, keep holding, and drag it into this project view folder here. Notice the icon changes. As soon as I let go, it just made a prefab. It's literally that easy. All we have to do is click and drag it into here. Now we could give it a name, but since we named it already platform 1x5, we don't even need to change that. That's perfect. So what I can do now is in the hierarchy, I'm going to select that one and delete it. Just before I do, notice it turned blue. What this means is this object is from a prefab. So notice background object still isn't blue. It's still this white color. That's because it's not a prefab. We also got this little icon here. So I'm going to show you that a bit more in a minute here, but let's select this one and just delete it first. So now we have no platforms in our scene. If I want to add a platform now, all I have to do is drag in this prefab and I can put it anywhere I want. So I can put a prefab right here. Now I got a platform. If I want another one, I drag it in, another, and now we have 3 platforms in our game. And now notice all these platforms are the exact same, they're just in a different spot. Now to demonstrate the analogy I used earlier of steering wheels coming out of a factory, I want to show that. So each of these 3 platforms are separate from each other. They're all created from this master prefab here, or if you want to call it like a mold for an assembly line or a factory. So they all were created by this prefab, but each one of them is separate from each other. So if I move one, it doesn't move the other. And if I click the arrow here to expand it, see I have this child object. If I move this, notice it moves this one, but it doesn't move the ones in the other. If I was to go here and change the color, so I can kind of make this one tinted dark green, notice it only changes this one because each of these prefabs are separate from the next. Now that's one way to modify an object, but what if I had, let's actually delete this one because I modified it. Let's drag in a few more. So one of the most powerful things of prefabs is, say I have all of these platforms here, but you spend a week, you're making your game, you make a bunch of changes, and then you realize, you know what, the first 2 or the middle 2 tiles of this should be a darker color than the outside ones. And you don't want to have to go back and change all of them. Say you made a whole level and you have 60 of these platforms in there. You don't want to go in and manually have to change these platform or these 2 middle ones. So say these 2. In this example, let's say we want these 2, I'm going to go with these 2 middle sections here. Say we wanted these to be red, like this. Or you know what, let's do all 3. So I'm going to select the 3 middle sections. I'm going to pick a red color. There we go. Okay, so say we want every platform that's 1x5 in our game, or even the level, to have the middle platform colors be this color. We would have to go in and do this exact step on every single one of them and make sure we get everything right. The bonus with prefabs, we have multiple different ways to do this now. So I'm just going to change this back so I can show you both ways. Okay, let's go out of here. I'm going to expand this back. Okay, so let's say we have our level now. We have all the platforms in there and we're about to change these middle ones to be the color. Because I was going into this prefab here and modifying the colors already, That does make a change that's more complex. I want to cover later, not now. So just to eliminate that, I'm going to delete this platform that I was playing around with. And I'm just going to drag in a new one in its place. So now we have 4 platforms here. This is simulating a huge level with as many platforms as we want. The way we can start to edit them all, there is a few different ways, but we want to talk about prefab edit mode first. So what I can do is I can modify this prefab down here instead of each one of the instances individually. And that's what these are called. So when we drag in a new copy from our prefab, this is called an instance of that prefab. But if we go down here, if we double click on this prefab itself, now our scene changes into this other window, which is called prefab edit mode. This is where we can actually modify the prefab. So if we look on the left in the hierarchy, we lost all the normal scene view stuff and we just have the name of our prefab and we see all the objects in it. So any change we make in the prefab here, this is going to get sent out to all of them. So in the analogy I gave earlier of the factory making steering wheels, you can think of this almost like a recall, where they basically send out saying, you know what, that steering wheel was wrong. We should have did this on it instead. And they'll call them all back, make the change, and then give them back to the people. That's basically what we're doing here. So let's select grass mid 1. I'm going to hold Control and click the other 2 grass mids. So now we have the 3 selected, and let's change the color to red. Okay, so we see the change here. Now there's no save button. All we have to do is exit prefab mode. So if we look on the left here of the hierarchy, we have this little arrow. This is going to take us back to the scene. That takes us out, and notice now all our platforms changed where the middle is red, and even the icon of the prefab. And now if I drag in a new prefab, it has that change. So that's one way that we can make changes to a prefab. That's the easiest one. But just for the sake of clarity, so you know, I'm going to show you how we can make other changes. So say if you're not too sure what the change is yet, or you're playing around with one of these instances of a prefab, so something in the game. Let's look at, say we're playing with this one. We expand it open, and let's pick this grass mid, and we're going to change this color to blue. So say we change that and we're like, oh, you know what? I really like that. Instead of having to copy that color, go into this prefab edit mode down here, make the change, send it out, what we can do is make the change from this prefab itself. So if we go to the top here to the actual parent one that we made into a prefab, notice here, we have a new tab. We didn't have this before. We have a prefab little section now. So we have an open button. What this will actually do is this is going to open the prefab in prefab edit mode like we had. I'm just going to click out of here. We don't want that right now. We have a select button. If I click that, it's going to go and find the prefab in the project folder down here. So right now in this case, it didn't look too beneficial. But when you start having possibly even hundreds of folders down here, finding the exact prefab you're working with can be very difficult. This button will take you right to it. Okay, and then the next thing, this is what we want here. We have a drop down that says overrides. What an override is it means we change something on the prefab. So if we click the overrides drop down, it's going to show us what's different than this prefab here. So it's going to say the override is we changed the sprite renderer on grass mid, which made it a different color. So if we want, we can take that override and we could either do revert all. What that means is revert all is going to wipe out all changes we made to this prefab, and it's going to turn it back into this one. But now if I go back to grass mid, I'm going to change this color again. So now we got it blue again. This time, if I do apply all, what this will do is it's going to take these changes I made, which are called overrides, and it's going to apply them to this master prefab down here, which is essentially going to push it out to all of them. So if I hit apply all here, now it changed them all. So this video was a lot to take in. I am well aware of that. I would recommend play around with this. Try making a couple objects yourself and turning them into a prefab. You know what? Find something you like in here, even in the sprites. Let's, find some little alien or something like this. Bring this guy into your project and make him into a prefab, and then make a couple copies of him and try making some changes. Get some practice. Hands-on practice is the best way I can recommend to learn all of this. It's very hard to take in at the start, and just watching somebody do it without you doing hands-on work, you're not going to remember it as well. So try doing as much as you can here. If you still have problems, you may want to even watch the video again, because sometimes you will take in a lot more the second time watching it after you tried it out a bit.